What if I tell you that Captain America: Winter Soldier is not just a fiction Marvel film, it's a real story based on WWII real experiments? During World War II, Nazi scientists conducted horrifying freezing experiments on prisoners, pushing the human body to impossible limits. Victims were submerged in icy water or left naked in snow to study hypothermia for battlefield survival. These brutal tests weren't science fiction. They were real, deadly, and left a dark legacy of human suffering behind. In 1942, the German army was freezing into the ground on the Eastern Front. Their pilots were falling into the icy North Sea and dying in minutes. The Nazi high command was panicking. They needed to know, how long can a human body actually last in the ice before it just quits? To find out, they didn't use mannequins. They used people. But here is the part that will make your skin crawl. The lead doctor behind these experiments, a man named Sigmund Rascher, was so obsessed with his data that he allegedly lied to Himmler himself about his results just to keep the funding coming. Even more shocking, decades later, modern scientists are still arguing over whether it's ethical to use this tainted data to save people today. Stay with me, because we're going into the dark heart of Dachau. We're looking at the experiments that pushed humans to the literal edge of existence and the horrifying legacy they left behind. It is 1941. The German High Command is intoxicated by its own success. Operation Barbarossa has kicked off, and Hitler's army thinks they have already won. They believe the vocation of arms is a simple matter of logistical efficiency and superior steel. But then, the Russian winter hits like a hammer from the gods. We aren't talking about wear a jacket cold, we are talking about 40 degrees. This was a pattern interrupt on a continental scale. The architecture of war simply shattered. Tank engines wouldn't start because the oil had turned into the consistency of molasses. Rifles and machine guns froze shut, their metal parts fused by the frost. And the soldiers? The master race was dropping like flies. They weren't dying from bullets. They were dying from a biological breakdown. They were experiencing total system failure through hypothermia. The Nazis suddenly realized that their identity conflation as invincible conquerors was a lie. They were actually very fragile biological organisms, and they had zero empirical data on how to treat a frozen pilot who had bailed out into the North Sea, or a shivering infantryman in a trench. They didn't know how long a human could survive in ice water. They didn't know if rapid rewarming would kill the heart or save it. In the official world of German medicine, there were only theories. And the generals didn't have time for theories. They needed a tactical discovery. They needed to know the exact survival threshold of the human body. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. They needed someone who was willing to ignore the human factor entirely. Enter Sigmund Rascher. Rascher wasn't just a doctor. He was a high-altitude climber and a fanatical member of the SS who had the direct ear of Heinrich Himmler. He didn't see the ethical mandates of medicine as a boundary. He saw them as friction that slowed down progress. To Rascher, the concentration camps weren't just prisons, they were a human laboratory. He saw a trapdoor in the morality of the state. He realized that while the world was looking at the big maps, he could perform micro-surgery on the human body's breaking point. He proposed a series of experiments that would become some of the darkest chapters in the history of science. He wanted to find out exactly how much anterior congestion the brain could take before it flickered out in the cold. He moved his operations to Dachau. There he would attempt to bridge the gap between total war and total medicine. He wasn't looking for a cure, he was looking for a survival metric. He was going to use the industrial slaughter of the camps to provide the empirical data that the official world of the army was screaming for. It was the beginning of the freezing experiments, a project where the architecture of decision-making was reduced to a stopwatch and a tank of ice water. The master race was about to try and hack the code of life by destroying it. Imagine the pattern interrupt of a nightmare. You are dragged out of your barracks at 3:00 a.m. There is no explanation, no trial, and no official mandate other than the whim of the SS. You are stripped naked and forced into a tank of water chilled with massive blocks of ice until the temperature mimics the lethal waters of the North Sea. This wasn't a freak occurrence. This was the systematic reality for hundreds of prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. Sigmund Rascher and his team, including established medical figures like Ernst Holzleiner, weren't looking for a cure for the common cold. They were operating under a vocation of arms disguised as science. They were looking for the survival limit. They wanted to map the exact architecture of death so that the Luftwaffe could know exactly how much time a downed pilot had before his brain surrendered to the froth. They treated these human beings as biological assets. They would insert sensors deep into the victims' bodies to track their core temperature in real time. On their clipboards, they didn't record names. They recorded data points. They watched with mechanical detachment as the human factor began to dissolve. First the violent shivering, the body's desperate attempt to create heat, then the anterior congestion of the mind as consciousness slipped away. They watched the skin turn a bruised necrotic blue and the heart rate slow to a rhythmic crawl. Through these horrific microservices, they discovered a statistical threshold. Most people reached the point of no return when their core temperature hit 77 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the world of Nazi empirical data, the experiment didn't stop at death. They were obsessed with the idea of reanimation. If a pilot was pulled from the ocean appearing dead, could he be brought back to life? They began to test different methods of rapid rewarming. They tried electrolamp beds that blistered the skin. They tried internal irrigation with boiling water. They even experimented with what Rascher called animal heat, placing a freezing victim between two naked female prisoners to see if biological transfer was more effective than a machine. This was the ultimate identity conflation. Rascher believed he was a pioneer, a heroic scientist saving German lives, but in reality, he was just a butcher with a thermometer. He was creating a tapestry of suffering that provided almost zero usable medical knowledge. Because the friction of the camp conditions, starvation, stress, and exhaustion, meant the data didn't even apply to healthy pilots. Yet, the official world of the Nazi military kept funding him. They wanted the wink that told them they could conquer the winter. They wanted to believe that if they just had the right logistical efficiency, they could defeat biology itself. As the tanks at Dachau filled with bodies, a larger question began to loom, one that haunts us in 2025. What happens to the empirical data when the monsters are gone? Do we burn the records of the human laboratory, or do we use the blood-stained knowledge to save others? Once a victim was nearly frozen, the doctors tried different ways to warm them up. They used heat lamps, they used boiling water, they even tried animal warmth, forcing the frozen victims into beds with other people to see if body heat was enough. Rascher's notes are chillingly casual. He writes about subjects like they are pieces of wood. He was looking for the most efficient way to get a pilot back into a plane. But there was a problem. Rascher was a fraud. Later investigations suggested he faked some of his success stories to look like a hero. He was so desperate for status that he ignored the human narrative and replaced it with lies. While these clinical brutalities were unfolding inside the wire, the world outside remained stubbornly human. It's easy to look at the charts and the death curves of Sigmund Rascher's reports and see the victims as mere biological shells. But they weren't just data points. They were fathers, brothers, and sons. They were men with lives that had narrative weight. We know this because of the wartime correspondence found after the liberation, letters that crossed paths in the dark, often never reaching the hands they were intended for. Think about the eerie coincidence of a single Tuesday in 1942. In a laboratory at Dachau, Sigmund Rascher is staring at a stopwatch, measuring the exact second a human heart stops in a tank of ice. At that same moment, a few hundred miles away, a woman is sitting at a kitchen table, writing a letter to her husband. She asks if he's eating enough. She tells him that their son just learned to ride a bicycle. She tells him she has saved a bit of sugar for when he comes home. This is the stark contrast of the era. On one side, you have the absolute degradation of the human person, where a doctor has replaced empathy with microsurveillance. On the other, you have the profound capacity for love, expressed in a simple piece of paper. One system was designed to turn a human into mechanical fuel, the other was a desperate attempt to maintain an identity conflation with the life they once knew. Many of these letters were written on official camp forms, four-lined pages that were strictly censored. The prisoners were forced to write "I am well" even as their bodies were being destroyed by the freezing experiments. It was a rigid form of official obfuscation, but between the lines, the human factor always leaked through. A coded hint about hunger, a shaky signature that betrayed a freezing hand, or a tear stain on the paper that the censors missed. The Nazis tried to turn people into data, but the letters proved they were always stories. When we read these letters today, we perform a pattern interrupt on the Nazi legacy. We refuse to see the cold metric, we see the warm memory. The tragedy isn't just that these men died. It's that the official world tried to erase the fact that they were ever loved. They were more than their core temperature. They were the anterior congestion of a mother's heart. They were the open loop of a family that waited for a return that never came. By preserving these letters, we bridge the trap door between the lab and the home. We remind ourselves that in the face of industrial slaughter, the most powerful act of resistance isn't a weapon, it's a wartime correspondence that says, "I remember you." After the smoke cleared in 1945 and the vocation of arms was replaced by the vocation of justice, the world found itself facing a military crisis of a completely different kind. It wasn't about territory or logistical efficiency, it was about the ownership of truth. As the Allied investigators moved through the ruins of the Third Reich, they found them. Sigmund Rascher's notebooks. These weren't just scraps of paper, they were meticulously kept journals of clinical brutality. They contained detailed maps of the human factor at its absolute breaking point. They held empirical data about the physiology of hypothermia that no one else in the world possessed, and that no ethical scientist would ever be allowed to replicate. This created an immediate pattern interrupt in the world of medicine. For the first time, the official world was forced to ask a question that still haunts us in 2025. What do we do with the blood-stained knowledge? Imagine a scenario in the modern day. A child falls through the ice of a frozen lake. They are pulled out blue, motionless, their core temperature plummeted far below what textbooks say is survivable. In that moment of anterior congestion, a doctor has to make a choice. Should they consult the Nazi data to understand the most effective way to rewarm a human heart without causing it to fail? This is the ethical dilemma of historical memory. It is a rigid conflict between two schools of thought. On one side, you have the abolitionists. These scientists and ethicists argue that the data is fundamentally tainted. They believe that because the information was gathered through absolute degradation and the suspension of the human condition, it has no place in the architecture of a moral society. To use Rascher's notebooks, they argue, is to validate the torture. It is to give the Nazi doctors what they always wanted, a seat at the table of legitimate science. They believe the only vocation of justice is to burn the books and start over, ensuring that the micro-surveillance of the camps never benefits the world that built them. But then you have the utilitarians. They argue that the victims have already paid the ultimate price. To discard the data, to let the empirical discovery vanish into the ash, is to make their suffering truly meaningless. They believe that if a single life can be saved by knowing exactly when the survival threshold is reached, that life becomes a living monument to the men who died in those tanks. In their view, justice isn't found in burning the information, it's found in repurposing it to serve humanity instead of total war. This debate has reached the highest levels of the official world. In the 1980s and 90s, major medical journals had to decide whether to allow citations of the Dachau experiments. Some researchers pointed out that Rascher's logistical efficiency was actually flawed, that his empirical data was skewed by the fact that the prisoners were already starved and exhausted. This suggested a lateral threat to the science itself. The data might not even be accurate. And yet, even today, the Dachau data is whispered about in the study of high-altitude medicine and cold water survival. It remains a ghost in the machine. By using this knowledge, are we becoming accomplices to Sigmund Rascher across the decades? Or are we performing the ultimate pattern interrupt by turning a system of aggression into a system of healing? There is no easy architecture of decision-making here. When we look at those notebooks, we see the trapdoor of science. We see what happens when the human factor is removed from the search for truth. We are forced to realize that knowledge is never neutral. It carries the weight of the vocation that created it. In the end, the dilemma of the Dachau data reminds us that we cannot separate science from history. Every discovery we use has a geography of origin. The question isn't just what we know, but how we came to know it. And as we move forward into a new century of microsurveillance and biotech, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to pay for the miracle of survival? Because once you open the vault of tainted knowledge, you can never truly close it again. The wink of the Nazi doctor still lingers in the margins of the charts, a reminder that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't cold, it's indifference. We look back at the freezing experiments of the Third Reich, and we try to find a logical framework. We try to classify it as extreme science or wartime necessity. But when we strip away the official language and the white lab coats, we are left with a singular, terrifying truth. The frozen soldier experiments were never about medical advancement. They were the ultimate expression of state-mandated cruelty. This was the architecture of the abyss. It was a world where the human factor was not just ignored, it was systematically dismantled. The man at the center of this psychological desperation, Sigmund Rascher, didn't survive to see the Nuremberg reckoning. In a twist of eerie coincidence, he wasn't executed by the Allies or the victims he tortured. He was eventually executed by the Nazis themselves. In the final, paranoid days of the Reich, Rascher's own architecture of deception collapsed. He had lied to Heinrich Himmler about his wife's miraculous late-age pregnancies. They had actually been kidnapping infants to prove their master race theories. When the internal surveillance of the SS discovered the fraud, Rascher and his wife were thrown into the very camps they had once managed. He was executed with a pistol shot in Dachau just days before the American liberation. It was a fitting, circular end for a man who had turned human suffering into a career path. He was consumed by the very system of aggression he helped perfect. But while the man is gone, his legacy remains. It sits on our library shelves like a toxic asset. It remains a permanent pattern interrupt in the history of human progress. The tragedy of Rascher is a warning for the 21st century. It warns us about what happens when we prioritize empirical data over human rights. In our modern world of big data, biometric tracking, and algorithmic surveillance, the temptation to treat people as sets of numbers is stronger than ever. We are constantly tempted to look for the logistical efficiency of a solution while ignoring the identity of the people affected by it. We must remember that knowledge without empathy is just a high-tech form of industrial slaughter. When we ask ourselves, what are the limits of humanity, we usually think of the biological threshold. We think of the 40-degree Russian winter, the 77-degree heart failure, and the anterior congestion of the freezing brain. We think of how much friction the body can take before it breaks. But the real limits of humanity aren't measured by how much cold we can take. They are measured by how much compassion we can keep when the world around us turns dark. They are measured by our refusal to step through the trapdoor of tactical necessity at the expense of another's soul. Sigmund Rascher looked at a freezing man and saw a data point. The families who wrote the wartime correspondence looked at the same man and saw a life worth living. History has shown us which side was rigid and which side was truly resilient. As we close the black archive on the Dachau experiments, we perform a final vocation of memory. We acknowledge that the human factor is the only thing that matters in the architecture of decision-making. We choose to remember the fathers, the brothers, and the sons not as survival metrics, but as human beings who were loved. The frozen soldier is a ghost that will always haunt the official world of science. He stands at the edge of the human laboratory, a silent witness to what happens when we lose our internal moral compass. He reminds us that the greatest tactical discovery we can ever make is the realization that every human life is an open loop of infinite value, one that no stopwatch can ever truly measure. If we forget the human narrative, we become the ice. But if we remember, we keep the fire alive. Before we wrap up this journey into the darkest corners of the human laboratory, here's one last bonus story from the files of the impossible. While the Nazi official world was systematically testing the limits of cold, there was a man in Japan who was unintentionally testing the statistical improbability of survival itself. Meet Tsutomu Yamaguchi. In the architecture of fate, Yamaguchi is a pattern interrupt so profound it borders on the supernatural. He is the only man officially recognized by the Japanese government to have been at the epicenter of both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings, and lived to tell the story. Imagine the human factor in this scenario. It's August 6, 1945. Yamaguchi is in Hiroshima on a final business trip for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He is walking toward the shipyards when the first sun falls. He sees the atomic flash, feels the heat of 1,000 summers, and is thrown into a potato patch as his eardrums shatter. He survives the industrial slaughter of the first city, bandaged and burned, and does the only logical thing his internal moral compass tells him to do. He goes home. He catches a train, a miracle of logistical efficiency in a collapsing nation, and returns to his hometown. On August 9, he is sitting in an office in Nagasaki, explaining to his stunned supervisor that a single bomb had leveled Hiroshima. His boss doesn't believe him. He calls the story impossible, and at that exact moment, the second sun rises over Nagasaki. Yamaguchi lived through the double pattern interrupt of the nuclear age. He survived 2 blasts that were designed to leave no survivors. He became a double witness to the end of the world, a man who outran the vocation of arms twice in 3 days. If you think surviving an ice tank in Dachau is a miracle of biology, wait until you hear how this man survived 2 suns falling on his head and lived to the age of 93. Jack Nicotero must have lived in the days of 93. His life is the ultimate lateral threat to the idea that humans are just data points. He proved that the identity of a survivor is more resilient than the most rigid weapons of mass destruction. You can watch that full, staggering story of survival by clicking the video on the left. And if you want to dive back into the abyssal dark to hear about the Seawolf ghost boat, the Nazi submarine laden with a liquidated treasury of gold that vanished in the Atlantic, click the video on the right. These are the open loops of history that the official world tries to forget. Hit the subscribe button to help us keep these stories alive and to ensure that the human factor is never erased by the empirical data. I'll see you in the next one.